talking tonight about signatures and receipts in the supply chain security. So thoughts are in my own, don't quote me, and I'm not representing my employer whatsoever. Let's kick it off. So I'm just going to frame it through the fact that so there is an issue, and everybody knows this. The public sector is constantly being attacked. Basically the problem is that after public sector or various agencies buy the software, that software is just not maintained, right? So there are a bunch of vulnerabilities. Nobody actually knows what is inside. They have kind of ways of dealing with this. They say, okay, let's just do pen tests. Let's do pen tests every year. But that's just not enough, right? So there's just not enough transparency. And we've got SolarWinds, right? So which totally triggered everybody. And that was like the pinnacle of everything. And what happened was that it ended up converting into an executive order in the States. And then everybody in the industry was afraid, because that meant that suddenly you couldn't really sell to the federal government, right? Because unless you comply with the requirements. So a bunch of folks jumped in together. And this way, sort of a skit was born, in amongst other ideas as well that are currently being surfaced. So SCET is supply chain, integrity, transparency, and trust. A catchy thing. The box with receipts actually represents what I think. That's the way I imagine this. But getting back to this, right? So why would you even listen to me? So I actually forgot to introduce myself, but I'm talking about this purely because for the past year, so I'm a developer, and I've been thrown into one room with security researchers to kind of work on these things related to supply chain security. So we've got a box of receipts effectively, and I think that's the way you can picture this whole idea. We're going to get to signatures quickly. Right, so just here I've got some kind of evolution being presented. It's not that nice. I lost some contrast nonetheless. The gist is there. So basically we're, public private key encryption and object signing and encryption is there for quite a while. We've had it for like 50 years. I'd like to stress the fact that, JWT was effectively very, very popular, and it's very successful. And I think it's simplicity and the fact that you can adopt. It's very easy to work with. It's JSON. So the whole success was there, and it all kind of culminates in JOSI, which is basically a set of RFCs that we can work with for signing and encryption. And like, if you can see, like, there are basically 2 years difference, and the COSI comes out. So what the hell is COSI? And COSI is the same as JOSI, right? So it's just, instead of working on top of JSON to do signing and encryption, it actually works on CBOR. A CBOR stands for a concise binary object representation. It's a bit of a mouthful if you want to kind of unwrap it all. But it has its own kind of use cases. And what happens in SCIT, sort of in these recent ideas, is that they adopt COSI. They basically say, like, you should use COSI instead of JOSI. Well, it caused some discussions, but, well, that's their stance. Right, so high-level overview. So what SCIT in theory is, and what does COSI and the specs or RFCs related to this allow us to do. So we have, and if we think about supply chain in itself, so essentially software supply chain, when you're selling a product, you're selling something. So you might have additional documents to this. So you have your pen test that you have to do before selling. In addition to that, you would have additional vulnerability disclosures that would come in along the way. So the idea is that you sign these sort of related documents kind of representing your product and additional supportive documentation, and you put that into sort of a storage. What type of storage the SCIT doesn't really talk about, doesn't really force on top of you, but the idea is that it should be auditable. So at any point in time, like after 5 years, you should be able to go back, and if there is an issue, you could audit what happened with the product, what sort of, maybe there were issues, maybe there are additional vulnerabilities, there was a vulnerability, it was fixed, et cetera, et cetera. So, and a side effect of actually falling back on COSI and its the ability to do counter signatures is the fact that you can get a distributable receipt. So you basically create a bunch of signatures, and you countersign them in this sort of big storage place. And you can take that distributable receipt and actually give it to your customer. And this is basically the point of this. I'm going to get to this, to the details, what that is. So COSI, what it is. So, CBOR object signing and encryption. It's, if you're familiar with JWT, is basically the same thing. You have headers, the structure is going to be shortly there. But why would you even choose this? Why would you ever consider COSI instead of like using JSON? So it's smaller, but it's smaller, including a encoder and decoder, and especially in small environments. So if you're future proofing, that means that if you're on a small device, you would probably want to make sure that it takes as little place as possible. One of the things is obviously, or if you're transmitting data on something like LoRaWAN, right? So you want to make sure that you transmit as little as possible, and that's what kind of makes sense. Obviously, the other thing is that you can kind of embed bytes without actually encoding them into using something like base64 that you would use in JSON. So that's great. And standardized kind of signatures, sort of you have RFCs you can work with, which makes it kind of easy to adopt, and the amount of libraries is actually growing now. Now I'm saying almost standardized kind of signatures. I'm going to get to there. So general structure is just on the left side we have the COSI signed envelope example. On the right-hand side, we have a counter-signature example. So as I mentioned before, so COSI envelope is just, we have headers, protected and protected, we have payload and signature. That's pretty much it. And the counter-signature is another thing. So these two things separately, if you think about this. So you could equally verify a signed payload by just making sure that its signature is actually valid. So provided you have access to public keys. The same thing you could do to the counter signature. So if you could just validate it against the public keys. But the neat trick here is that once you countersign, you could just ignore the initial signed payload and provided that you trust the counter signature and in the issuer who issued that counter signature, because it already has the details. So within the signature that refer back to the protected headers and source signature and payload. So it has this sort of so it's like these are like two puzzle pieces, and then you can just distribute that counter signature, and the customer should be basically content. And they could just, if you distribute that along with the public keys, they could just validate that thing in even like in air-gapped environments. So the important thing is, so far I'm basically talking about supply chain security, but so like, okay, envelopes, great. So what sort of use is that? Like, why would you even use it? Why complicate your life with all of this? Why not just use like digests or checksums that have been used for forever and to check the integrity of binaries that are being used? And so the payload is actually the crux here. And the SCIT doesn't really talk about payloads. Basically says you can sign anything you want. But I think here the important bit is that after SolarWinds, and if you look into the states and the federal government of what they're doing, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology comes and just helps with this. So they basically even now, they come out and said, well, if you want to sell something to government, you should at least include SBOM. And SBOM is like software bill of materials, kind of lists all of the dependencies. So if you are pen testing, right? So if you have an SBOM, like it just makes your life much, much easier because you can see what's inside. Contrary to now, where you basically do like a blind reconnaissance and trying to guess what is inside to understand how far it can go. In addition to that, there is a now movement to include VDRs, which is a vulnerability disclosure report. There are also talks in the background of including more pen test reporting also as being kind of standardized and not just PDF. Right, but there are some other challenges, and as I've mentioned, so although there is a COSI RFCs mention the fact that you have a signing envelope and you can have a counter signature. If you look then into SCIT, that kind of was born out of all of this, like SolarWinds, they actually have a very slightly different signature. And even if you look wider into various solutions currently being you can buy, for instance, on Amazon or on Azure. They also, in some storage solutions, they use receipts, but they would just use, for instance, their own made-up structure, which might be similar, but it might be using, for instance, JSON and not CBOR. So it's different. And again, missing tooling, just because, in JSON, it's very easy. There's a bunch of libraries, obviously with their own issues, but they exist. CBOR is fairly new. And there are libraries, and they're penetrating into various libraries and various languages and their package managers, but it's still early days. Problems with receipt verification. Receipt verification, although you might think that you have RFCs, but the receipt verification in itself, because there are slight differences, you might not always actually get a easily accessible library, which is pain. And then, you have to work with RFCs and CBOR in that case, just pain. And one of the big issues as well, which is not obvious, although the idea is, look, big corp, they're selling something, they're just going to come in and dump in all of these SBOM, all of these documents into this big storage, and then some customer who's buying, they're going to be able to verify all of this just by looking at public keys. But the actual problem is, how do you link all of that together? If you want to do a vulnerability disclosure against some product, how do you do this? So, how do you reference this? Even if there is something exists, and it's somewhere maybe public, and you want to publish it. So how do you do this? In various other environments, in GitHub, you could say, okay, so this is the dependency, this is the version, and you just publish it. But so it's difficult. So just to summarize, I think, so it was my short first speech in a conference that I was allowed to make. And the goal of this was to highlight the fact that it's not that easy. And although this idea is being sold, and even Google is trying to push Salsa on NPM and sort of similar but different ways of solving the problem. But I think that the problem is that there needs to be a lot of more work done, and especially in open source, we just need more libraries to help out with for various organizations who are building software. To make sure that they're able to use these tools, they're able to use their signing and proper encryption, and they're able to share that with their customers. So so I think it's just a call out, and there is a bit of a opportunity because there are not enough libraries. So if you want to introduce your own vulnerabilities in the public sphere, in the user land, so yes, feel free to do that. So. Bit of references. I actually had to do the first link is I had to do the playground for myself related to Cozy's signatures and counter signatures purely because it's hard to work with. So I was using the centralized identifiers, the ADs, to make sure that the public keys are discoverable. It's very hard, right? So if you're working there and on your machine and you want to do something, it's just so hard. So I thought I'm just going to go do this. There's a skit.io if you want to expand on additional information about it. And there's a link to SBOMs in the publication by NIST about SBOMs and the fact that you kind of need to use them and what they are. That's it. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. So thanks.